My name is Charlie Wilson, and I have been invisible for most of my life, not literally, of course. I am flesh and blood, 2 arms, 2 legs, one face that people describe as unremarkable when they are being kind and forgettable when they are not. I stand at average height, keep my hair cut short because long hair gets in the way when you are carrying heavy trays, and I have eyes that shift between green and gray depending on the light and my mood. I am 23 years old. I am an Omega. And for the past 2 years, I have worked as a server at the Aldermere Grand Hotel, which is, by any reasonable measure, the most prestigious hotel in the city. Prestigious. That is the word people use. What they mean is expensive. What they mean is that the carpets are so thick your shoes sink into them like snow, that the chandeliers drip crystal like frozen waterfalls, that the air always smells faintly of fresh flowers and expensive cologne and the particular brand of self-satisfaction that only the very wealthy can afford to emit. I had learned to move through it all like water. Quiet. Useful. Unseen. That morning, I woke up at 5, the way I always did. My apartment was small enough that I could stand in the center of it and touch both the kitchen counter and the edge of my bed without fully extending my arms. I had a window that faced a brick wall. I had a coffee maker that wheezed like an old dog every time it brewed. I had a small collection of paperback books stacked beside my bed, their spines cracked and their pages soft from rereading. I had, in other words, enough. I told myself that every morning. Enough. I showered, dressed in my uniform, the white shirt and black vest and pressed black trousers that the hotel required, and I caught the early bus to the Aldermere. The city was still half asleep at that hour. The streets were quiet except for delivery trucks and the occasional jogger, and the sky above the buildings was the color of diluted ink, not quite dark, not quite light. I liked those early mornings. They were mine. The hotel came alive the moment I stepped through the staff entrance. The kitchens were already roaring, the breakfast prep team in full motion, the smell of butter and coffee and toasting bread filling the back corridors like a warm hand on the shoulder. I signed in, collected my assignment sheet from the board, and stopped when I read it. Conference Room 7. Full day assignment. Private event. I looked at my supervisor, a stout woman named Marjorie who had been working at the Aldermere for 20 years and had the unflappable calm of someone who had seen everything twice. Conference 7. I asked, Alpha Council quarterly meeting, she said without looking up from her clipboard. They booked the whole East Wing. Full catering service, 11 hours. Plus setup and breakdown. I processed this. The Alpha Council. I had heard of them, of course. Everyone had. They were the governing body of the 7 major Alpha houses in the region, an ancient institution dressed up in modern suits, meeting 4 times a year to discuss territory, trade, and the various political mechanics that kept the hierarchy running smoothly. They were powerful in the way that old money is powerful, quietly, comprehensively, with the particular confidence of people who have never had to wonder whether their place in the world was secure. I was an Omega serving them tea. The universe, I had long since decided, had a specific and somewhat malicious sense of humor. Any special instructions? I asked. The usual. Be invisible, be prompt, keep the tea hot and the coffee fresh, don't speak unless spoken to, and under no circumstances make eye contact with any of the primary delegates. She paused, finally looking up at me over her reading glasses. There are 7 alphas in that room, Charlie. 7 high-ranking, territorial alphas in a closed space. Keep your suppressants current and your head down. My suppressants are always current, I said. Good. Then you'll be fine. I was not entirely sure about that, but I nodded anyway and went to collect my tray. The east wing of the Aldermere was separated from the rest of the hotel by a set of heavy oak doors that required a key card to open. Beyond them, the decor shifted subtly. The carpets went from deep burgundy to a rich, dark green, the walls were paneled in with the color of old honey, and the art changed from the tasteful neutral prints that decorated the public spaces to older, heavier pieces, oil paintings of landscapes and formal portraits that looked like they belonged in a museum. Conference Room 7 was at the end of the corridor. I arrived an hour before the meeting was scheduled to begin and spent that time setting up with 2 other servers, a woman named Priya and a young man named Theo, both of whom were betas and therefore significantly more relaxed about the assignment than I was. Have you done one of these before? I asked Priya as we arranged the tea service on the long sideboard that ran along the west wall of the room. Once, 2 years ago, she said. It's fine. They mostly ignore you. Just keep the carafes full and stay near the wall. Which house is which? Theo asked, peering at the name cards arranged at the long oval table. I found myself looking too, reading the names without meaning to. House Varon. House Caldwell. House Morrow. House Ashfield. House Dunn. House Pelletier. House Shaw. I stopped at the last one, Shaw. Something moved in my chest. Not recognition, exactly. More like the echo of a word I had heard once in a dream and could not quite place. I looked away. Doesn't matter which house is which, Priya said practically. They're all the same to us. Carafes. Refills. Invisible. Right, I straightened the cups and told myself to focus. The delegates arrived at 9. I stood near the sideboard, hands clasped, tray at the ready, and watched them file in. They were exactly what I had expected, tall, broad-shouldered, most of them middle-aged or older, dressed in suits that had been cut by someone who charged more for a single jacket than I made in 3 months. They carried authority the way other people carry briefcases, automatically, without thought, as though it had been packed into their bodies along with their bones. They took their seats without ceremony. Aides and assistants arranged themselves along the walls. Someone distributed bound folders. Someone else adjusted the lighting. The room settled into that particular pre-meeting hush that feels like the moment before an orchestra begins, and then the last delegate arrived. He came through the door slightly after the others, not late, exactly, more like precisely timed, the kind of entrance that managed to be unhurried without being disrespectful. He was younger than I had expected, late 20s perhaps, though there was something in his bearing that made age difficult to read. He was tall, with the kind of frame that filled a room without trying, dark hair worn slightly longer on top, a jaw that could have been sculpted, and eyes, when they swept across the room, that were a very deep, very dark gray. He was the representative of House Shaw, his name card read, Julio Shaw. He sat at the head of the table, not because the seating arrangement required it, but because the other delegates subtly, instinctively adjusted to give him that space. Alpha dynamics. The most dominant presence in the room naturally assumed the center of gravity. It was not a decision. It was physics. I kept my eyes on my tray. Tea, sir. I said to the nearest delegate, moving to his left and pouring with steady hands. The meeting began. For the first 2 hours, I was exactly what Marjorie had instructed. Invisible. Prompt. I moved around the table like a shadow, refilling cups before they were emptied. Replacing cooling carafes with fresh ones, keeping the small arrangement of pastries and fruit replenished without disrupting the flow of conversation. The council was discussing territorial boundaries, specifically a disputed corridor of land between the Morrow and Ashfield territories that had been generating friction for the past several months. I kept my expression neutral and my attention on my work. It was not my place to listen, even if I could not entirely avoid hearing. I was reaching across the table to remove an empty carafe when it happened. My sleeve caught the edge of a water glass. It did not fall. I caught it in time, fingers closing around the base with the automatic competence of someone who has carried trays for years. But the motion was sharp enough to draw a brief pause in the conversation. Every alpha in the room looked at me. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. No one said anything. Meetings were interrupted by servers all the time. It was nothing, except that Julio Shaw was still looking at me when the others had already returned to their folders. I set the glass down carefully, picked up the carafe, and retreated to the sideboard. I did not look back. I kept my shoulders straight and my breathing even, and I absolutely did not think about the quality of his attention, the way it had felt like sunlight focused through glass, warm and precise and not entirely comfortable. I thought about carafes. Tea. Invisible. At 12:30, the council broke for lunch. The delegates stretched and scattered into small conversational clusters. Aides moved in with phones and whispered updates. I began the process of clearing the table and resetting the carafes for the afternoon session, working quickly and methodically. You work here regularly. The voice came from just behind my left shoulder. I turned. Julio Shaw was standing approximately 3 feet away, which was close enough that I registered him as a physical presence before I registered him as a person. He was taller than he had appeared seated, and the gray of his eyes, up close, had depth in it, texture, like stone seen through clear water. I blinked. Yes, sir, I said. I'm assigned to this wing today. You're an Omega, he said. It was not a question or an accusation. It was stated the way someone states a fact. They are simply confirming, yes, sir. He looked at me for a moment that lasted slightly longer than standard social transaction would require, and I felt the particular awareness that Omegas sometimes feel in close proximity to a dominant alpha. Not fear, exactly, more like the body's way of paying very close attention. My suppressants were good. My training was better. I kept my expression professionally neutral. Your hands didn't shake, he said. I blinked again. Sir, when you caught the glass. Earlier. A slight tilt of his head. Most people in a room full of alphas get nervous. It affects their hands. I've been doing this for 2 years, I said. The nervousness mostly wore off in the first month. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The preliminary motion of one, Charlie, he said, reading my name tag. Yes, sir, you're efficient, thank you, sir, he nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence. And moved away to rejoin the other delegates. I turned back to the sideboard. My hands, which had been steady all morning, were trembling slightly now. I gripped the carafe handle until they stopped. The afternoon session ran long. By 4 o'clock, the territorial dispute had evolved into something more complicated. An argument about inheritance protocols within House Morrow that was generating significantly more heat than the morning's discussion. I moved around the table in my quietest mode, the one where I made myself as small and inoffensive as possible, practically a piece of furniture. At 4:40, one of the older delegates, House Varen's representative, a heavy-set man with silver hair and a kind of permanently dissatisfied expression that spoke of decades of political frustration, turned to look at me directly. You, he said. More coffee, of course, sir. I moved to refill his cup. The coffee this establishment serves is mediocre, he said, to no one in particular, as though narrating a personal grievance. I apologize for the inconvenience, sir. It was not my coffee to apologize for, but the response was automatic. It's fine, Renard, said Julio Shaw from across the table, without looking up from the document in front of him. The coffee is adequate. Lord Renard of House Varen subsided with a grunt. I completed the refill and retreated. 3 minutes later, Julio Shaw held his cup out slightly in my direction without interrupting the conversation he was having with the delegate to his right. Not a gesture of command. More like an acknowledgement that I was there and that he would appreciate a refill when convenient. I refilled it. He didn't look up, but there was a very slight incline of his head. I retreated again. Priya, passing me by the sideboard, gave me a look that I interpreted as the nonverbal equivalent of, well, that's interesting. I gave her a look back that said, it isn't. She did not appear convinced. The meeting concluded at 6:15, the delegates filed out with the same collective authority with which they had arrived, their aides materializing around them like planets around stars, absorbing papers and phones and whispered instructions. The room began to empty with the quick efficiency of people whose time was expensive. I was consolidating the remaining pastries onto a single tray when I realized that the room was, by degrees, nearly empty, and that the one person who remained was Julio Shaw, standing by the window at the far end of the room, phone to his ear, his back to me. I worked quietly. The sensible thing to do was finish quickly and leave before he concluded his call, which would mean we would not have to navigate another conversation that I did not know how to categorize. I was almost done when his call ended. You were here all day, he said from behind me. I turned. He was folding his phone into his jacket pocket. Yes, sir. Full day assignment, 11 hours, give or take. He looked at me in that direct, unhurried way he seemed to have, like a man who was accustomed to having time and chose to spend it actually looking at things. Do you enjoy it? He asked. It was such an unexpected question that for a moment I could only process it. Alphas did not generally ask servers whether they enjoyed their jobs. The question implied a category of consideration that most people in his position did not extend to people in mine. It pays my rent, I said, which was honest without being entirely an answer. That's not what I asked. I held his gaze for a moment. No, I said. I don't particularly enjoy it. But I'm good at it, and being good at something has its own satisfaction. He looked at me steadily. What would you enjoy? I almost laughed. That's a large question for 6 o'clock on a Sunday. This time the expression did resolve into something that was recognizably a smile, brief and slightly asymmetric, more in the eyes than the mouth. Fair enough, he said. He picked up the folder he had left on the table and turned toward the door. At the threshold he paused without turning around. Your instincts are good, Charlie. For what it's worth, he left. I stood in the emptied conference room with a tray of consolidate pastries in my hands and the particular feeling of someone who has just had a conversation they are going to be thinking about for considerably longer than is reasonable. I finished the breakdown, I caught the late bus home, I lay in my small bed in my small apartment and looked at the ceiling and thought, quite firmly and deliberately, about absolutely nothing. The next council meeting was in 3 months. I told myself this was irrelevant. The weeks passed the way weeks do when you are working and surviving and doing the quiet arithmetic of a functional life. I served breakfast in the main dining room, event lunches in the mezzanine, private dinners in the glass-walled suite on the 8th floor. I read my paperbacks. I walked when the weather allowed. I maintained the careful, contained rhythm of a person who has learned that wanting things too specifically leads to specific disappointments. I did not think about gray eyes or the way certain voices seem to occupy a room differently than others. I thought about it constantly. This was a problem, and I was aware of it, and I was managing it with the same methodical practicality I applied to everything else. Observation was not investment. Remembering a conversation did not constitute attachment. I was an Omega who had served tea at a council meeting and briefly caught the attention of a very senior Alpha who would not remember me by the following week. This was the correct interpretation of events. I believed it approximately 40% of the time. One Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the council meeting, I was clearing a private dining room on the hotel's 2nd floor when Marjorie appeared in the doorway with an expression I could not immediately read. You've been requested, she said. I looked up. By whom? House Shaw. They've booked the private suite on 7 for a working dinner tonight, 4 guests. They specifically requested you by name for the service. I held very still for a moment. By name, I said, by name. Charlie Wilson, room service for suite 704. She peered at me. Do you know why? I served the council meeting last month, I said. Perhaps they were satisfied with the service. Marjorie considered this with the expression of a woman who did not particularly believe it but could not argue with the explanation. Fine. Go change into the formal whites, they're a step above the standard assignment. Be there by 7:30, I went to change. I was very calm about it. Suite 704 was on the 7th floor, accessible only by a private lift that required a separate key card. It was one of the hotel's true prestige rooms, not a suite in the ordinary sense but a self-contained apartment, with a full dining room, a sitting area, a kitchen serviced by the hotel staff, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's evening skyline. I arrived at 7:20 with the drinks trolley and spent 10 minutes arranging the room before the guests arrived. Julio Shaw came with 3 others, 2 of whom I did not recognize and one of whom I identified from the morning's name card as the aide I had seen whispering in his ear throughout the afternoon session. A young woman with sharp eyes and a tablet in the crook of her arm. She looked at me when she entered and then looked at Julio Shaw and then looked back at her tablet with the carefully neutral expression of a professional who keeps her observations to herself. I kept mine to myself as well. The dinner was a working one in the genuine sense. They ate and talked simultaneously, the conversation circling around a set of documents that the aide, whose name I gathered was Sable, distributed over the first course. I served and refilled and removed plates and tried to be as much furniture as I had been in conference room 7. I was not, I noticed, managing it quite as well. Something in me kept recalibrating toward Julio Shaw the way a compass calibrates toward north. Not with drama but with the quiet, insistent accuracy of a thing that cannot help its own nature. He did not look at me. He was absorbed in his work, which was exactly appropriate. I had not expected him to. At the end of the 2nd course, as I was removing the plates, he said to Sable, "Can you give us 5 minutes?" Sable looked up, gathered her tablet and nodded to the other 2 men, who rose without comment and followed her to the sitting area. Sliding the glass partition mostly closed behind them, I reached for the last plate. "Charlie," he said. I straightened. He was looking at me with that direct quality again, the one that felt less like scrutiny and more like he was actually seeing you, which was, if anything, more disconcerting than scrutiny. "How long have you been in the city?" he asked. It was an oddly specific question. "About 2.5 years," I said. "Where before that?" "A few places." I kept my tone even. I moved around, something in his expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Where are you from originally?" I felt the question land somewhere that was not quite my chest and not quite my stomach, somewhere central, somewhere where old unease lived. I don't know, I said, which was true. I was in the system from young. No records of origin, a long pause, the system, he repeated, foster care, I said, to clarify. He looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation technically required. Something moved in his face that I could not identify. Not pity, which I would have recognized and resented, but something more complicated, something that had texture and weight. I see, he said. I waited for him to dismiss me or change the subject. Instead, he said, have you ever heard the name Caldwell Wilson? Everything stopped, not just inside me. The room, the city outside the window, the faint drift of conversation from the other side of the glass partition. Everything went very still. No, I said, and it was technically true, because I had heard Wilson on its own. Obviously, it was my name, but Caldwell Wilson as a compound had never been spoken to me directly, only glimpsed once, years ago, on a document I was not supposed to see. In handwriting I did not recognize, and even then I had told myself it was coincidence. Julio Shaw watched me. You hesitated, he said. Names make me thoughtful, I said, a flicker in those dark gray eyes that might have been the beginning of amusement. You're a very interesting person, Charlie Wilson. I serve tea, sir, among other things, he said, and there was something in his voice that made the words larger than they were on their face, as though they were containing something they had been asked to hold. He looked at his plate for a moment. Then, I apologize. I've made you uncomfortable. No, I said, which was also technically true. Discomfort was not quite the right word. More like the feeling of standing at the edge of something and not being certain of the drop. The dinner was excellent, he said, and it was clearly a conclusion, a gentle close to a conversation that had gone somewhere neither of us had entirely planned. I thanked him and withdrew. In the service corridor outside Suite 704, I stood with my back against the wall and breathed. Caldwell Wilson, the 7th Alpha House. The one whose seat at the council table had been marked with a different name at the morning's meeting, a proxy representative, because the Caldwell Wilson line had been interrupted by something I had only ever heard as rumor, the disappearance, years ago, of a child. An heir. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and told myself to stop. I was nobody. I was an omega from the system with a generic name and a borrowed apartment and a job carrying tea. I was nobody. I went back to work. If you are still watching, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's see what happens next. 2 weeks later, someone left something at the hotel. I found it when I was doing a final check of the small waiting area adjacent to conference room 7 after a morning corporate booking. It was an envelope, slim and cream-colored, resting on the side table near the window as though someone had set it down and forgotten it. It had no name on it. I picked it up with the intention of handing it to Lost and Found, then I noticed that it was sealed with a dark red wax seal stamped with the outline of 2 interlocking letters, a J and a C. I stood with it in my hands for a long time, then I put it in my pocket. This was not standard procedure. Lost items went to the front desk. I knew that. I had followed that protocol without exception for 2 years. I don't know exactly why I didn't that morning. Something in the weight of the envelope. Something in the specific quality of the silence in the room. Something that felt less like decision and more like recognition. I took it home that evening and sat at my small kitchen table with it for 15 minutes before I opened it. Inside was a single folded page. The letter was short. I know this is a strange way to reach you. I've been trying to think of a less strange way for several weeks and haven't managed it. I am attaching nothing to this note because that would be presumptuous, and I am committed, at minimum, to not being presumptuous. If you are who I think you might be, you deserve to know. If I'm wrong, you deserve an apology and a cleaner exit than I provided by writing this at all. There is a family that has been looking for someone for a long time. I am not in a position to explain more in a letter. But I would like to speak with you, if you're willing. No obligation. No pressure. If you prefer not to be contacted again, I will respect that entirely. Julio Shaw. Below the signature was a phone number. I read the letter 4 times, then I put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the drawer under my collection of paperbacks, under the Shakespeare and the Le Guin and the battered copy of a fantasy novel I had read so many times the spine had given up holding. I went to bed. I did not sleep. It took me 9 days to call the number. I had good reasons to wait. I was working. I needed to think. I needed to be certain I was not being naive or reckless or led somewhere by something as unreliable as curiosity and the memory of gray eyes. I called at 8 in the morning. Standing at my kitchen window watching the brick wall and drinking my wheezing coffee, he answered on the second ring. Charlie, he said, and the fact that he knew it was me before I spoke should have felt presumptuous but instead felt like something else, like being recognized. You left a letter in conference room 7, I said. I did. I wasn't sure you'd find it, it was on the side table. A brief pause. I see. Marginally less subtle than I was hoping for. Despite everything, something in my chest eased slightly. Your letter said you think I might be someone. Yes, who? A longer pause. I'd prefer to tell you in person. Not because I'm hiding anything, but because it's a conversation that deserves a real space. Not a phone line. I considered this. I don't know you, no. You don't. He sounded like a man who understood this completely and was not trying to argue against it. I could arrange to meet somewhere public. A place of your choosing. You could bring someone if you wanted. I could, I said. Would you? I looked at the brick wall. The coffee shop on Aldenmere Street. 3 blocks from the hotel. Saturday at 10, I'll be there, he said. I did not bring anyone. I arrived 8 minutes early because I am the kind of person who arrives early for things that make me nervous, so I can be seated before the other person arrives and have time to compose myself. I ordered a black coffee and took a table near the window and spent 7 minutes watching the street and 2 minutes talking myself out of leaving. Julio Shaw came through the door at exactly 10, he was different outside the hotel. Still the same physical person, obviously, same height and jaw and gray eyes, but without the suit and the council table around him he was somehow more human-scaled. He wore a dark jacket over a plain shirt, no tie, and he looked, for a man who controlled the affairs of one of the 7 most powerful alpha houses in the region, relatively normal. He saw me immediately and came to the table without looking around for me first, which meant he had already known where I was sitting, which meant he had been watching through the window before he came in, and I filed that away as information about the way he operated. He sat across from me and said, "Thank you for coming, I'm curious," I said. "That's all, I know." He ordered a coffee from the server who appeared and then looked at me with that quality of straightforward attention that I had been trying to forget for weeks. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear all of it before you respond." "Can you do that?" "I'm not known for impulsive reactions," I said, a faint smile. "No. I didn't think you were." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. House Caldwell Wilson was the 8th house of the Alpha Council. Not the 7th, as most people count, because it was struck from the official records approximately 20 years ago following an incident that the council agreed. Collectively, to classify as a family matter, I said nothing. The head of House Caldwell Wilson at that time was a man named Edmund Caldwell Wilson. He had 1 child, born to a contracted Omega, and the arrangement was not, by any contemporary standard, a good one. There were concerns about the welfare of the household. There were, allegedly, interventions that didn't take. And then, approximately 23 years ago, the child disappeared. My coffee cup was very heavy in my hands. The official record says the child died, Julio continued, his voice level and careful, in what was documented as an illness. Edmund Caldwell Wilson was not challenged on this. He was too powerful and the council was too reluctant to investigate. The house fell into a kind of managed dissolution. Edmund died 7 years later. The house's assets were placed in trust under council administration, pending what? I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of this, pending the heir's return, or formal confirmation of death. He looked at me. The trust has been in my family's administration because my mother and Edmund's Omega were close, before everything fell apart. House Shaw has been managing those assets for 16 years. You've had a financial interest in finding the heir, I said, yes and no. He didn't flinch from the observation. The assets revert to a public fund if the heir doesn't materialize by the heir's 25th birthday. I would not benefit from the heir's return, my family would lose the administrative fee. But my mother asked me, before she died, to keep looking. I set down my coffee. The morning was very quiet around us. Why me? I said, blood markers, he said. It's not something I can access without consent, but there's a test. A simple one. The Caldwell-Wilson line has a very specific genetic profile, documented with the council when the house was registered 3 generations ago. If you are who I think you might be, the markers will confirm it. A pause. Your age. Your name. The fact that you have no records of origin. The fact that you appeared in this city 2.5 years ago. Another pause, softer. And certain physical characteristics that are consistent with the Caldwell-Wilson bloodline. What characteristics? He looked at me steadily. Your eyes. They shift. Green in natural light, gray under artificial. It's a documented trait. Edmund's grandmother had it. It's in the original house records. I thought about every medical form I had ever filled out. Eye color, green/gray, changes with light. The nurses and administrators who had noted it and moved on. I need to think, I said. Of course, this is an enormous thing to tell someone over coffee, I know. I'm sorry. I have been trying to find a less blunt approach for 6 weeks and I'm not actually very good at being indirect, I noticed, I said. And then, because I was apparently incapable of simply being in a difficult moment without something in me reaching toward the absurd, you could have sent flowers first. The smile that broke across his face was different from the others I had seen, wider, more unguarded, as though it had surprised him. It transformed the austere architecture of his features into something warm and slightly complicated and very, very difficult to look away from. I'll note that for future reference, he said. We sat in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, an Alpha who ran one of the oldest houses in the region and an Omega who served tea, and we talked for another 2 hours about absolutely nothing connected to ancient bloodlines or council politics or genetic markers, just books and cities and the specific quality of early morning and what it felt like to be good at something you didn't love. I walked home through the pale morning light and thought that something in the center of my chest had shifted position, like furniture rearranged in a room, not entirely comfortable yet, but making more sense. I agreed to the test, not immediately. Not without considerable internal negotiation, but within 2 weeks of the coffee shop meeting, I presented myself at a private medical clinic that Julio had arranged, signed the necessary consents, and gave a small vial of blood to a very professional and entirely uncurious technician who processed it without asking questions. The results took 3 days. I spent those 3 days working and not thinking about it, which is to say I thought about almost nothing else. Julio called me on the evening of the 3rd day. The markers are confirmed, he said. All 7 primary indicators, plus 2 secondary ones they weren't expecting. Charlie. A pause. You are the Caldwell-Wilson heir. I was sitting on my bed. Outside my window, the brick wall was doing what it always did, which was exist, unchangingly, 3 feet away. Okay, I said. Okay, he repeated carefully. I need a day, take whatever you need. Will the council be notified? Not without your consent. Nothing moves without your consent. That's non-negotiable. I looked at the brick wall. I grew up in 12 different houses, I said. 11 foster placements and 1 group facility. I have no memories before age 4. No photographs. No family. My voice was steady. I had had 23 years to build a voice that did not crack. And you're telling me I have a bloodline and a house and assets in trust and a seat at a council table. Yes, he said, quietly, that's a lot, it is, and if I want none of it. A pause that lasted the right amount of time, long enough to take the question seriously, short enough not to be evasive. Then we figure out what you do want. The assets are yours regardless of whether you claim the house. The council seat is yours to refuse. Your bloodline doesn't obligate you to anything, except that the council will know, I said. And once they know, things change, some things, he admitted, things like me serving tea at their meetings, yes. And in his voice there was something very close to something I could not let myself name yet. Things like that. I called him back the next evening. I want to know more, I said. About the house. About what happened to Edmund's Omega. About where I actually came from. I'll tell you everything I know. I want to make my own decisions. I wouldn't have it any other way, and I said, and then stopped, because the next words were complicated, and I was not someone who said complicated things easily, yes. His voice was careful, attentive. I want to keep serving tea at the council meeting, I said. For now. Until I decide. Until it's on my terms. A long pause. I'll make sure the assignment goes through the same way, he he said. If that's what you want, it is, Charlie. Yes, I'm glad you called. I pressed my free hand flat against my kitchen table and felt the solid wood under my palm, real and cool and present. Don't make it sentimental, I said. Too late, he said, and I could hear the shape of the smile in his voice, that particular asymmetric warmth that I had decided I was allowed to simply observe without making meaning of it. I was making meaning of it. I knew I was making meaning of it. I hung up and went to make tea, because sometimes the simplest things are the most honest comfort you have. 3 months came around, as 3 months will. I was assigned to conference room 7 by my own arrangement, a quiet conversation with Marjorie who asked no questions and noted the request in her clipboard with the same unflappable calm as always. I arrived at the same time. I set up the room with the same care. I stood in my formal whites at the sideboard with my tray and my steady hands and my invisible face. The delegates filed in. Julio Shaw came last, the same unhurried timing, the same quality of presence. He took his seat. The meeting began. Midway through the morning, a new topic arrived on the agenda. One of the older delegates, House Dunn's representative, a thin woman with silver-streaked hair and the kind of precision that comes from decades of political navigation, set down her pen and said, "Before we proceed to the Ashfield Corridor matter, I'd like to raise the question of House Caldwell Wilson's trust administration timeline. The heir's 25th birthday is approximately 18 months out. We need to address the reversion protocol." The room adjusted slightly. The topic had weight, I believe, said Julio Shaw, setting down his own pen with a deliberate unhurriedness, that the question of reversion may be premature. A pause around the table. Julio, said House Moro's delegate, an older man with reading glasses, the line has been officially unverified for 2 decades. We've been through this, we have, Julio agreed. The situation has recently changed. Another pause, this one with a different quality. Changed how? House Varens Lord Renard asked. Julio looked up from his folder. He looked directly at me. I met his gaze. The room was very quiet. The Caldwell Wilson heir has been located and confirmed, Julio said. They are present in this room. Every alpha at the table turned. I stood at the sideboard with my tray, in my formal whites, with my shifting green-gray eyes and my steady hands and my 2.5 years of invisibility behind me. I set down the tray. My name is Charlie Wilson, I said, into the silence. And I believe I have a seat at this table. The next several minutes were, not to put too fine a point on it, extraordinary. Lord Renard went red. House Moro's delegate removed and replaced his glasses 3 times. House Ashfield's representative began speaking and then stopped and then began again. Sable, standing at the wall behind Julio Shaw's chair, managed to look simultaneously unsurprised and deeply satisfied. I stood at the end of the sideboard and allowed the noise to wash around me and kept my breathing even and my chin level. Julio, in the chair at the head of the table, was watching me with that steady quality, and his expression had in it something that I had stopped trying to categorize and had simply started receiving, something that said, "You're doing fine," something that said, "I see you," something that said, quietly and without performance, "I have been paying attention since a water glass nearly fell in a conference room 3 months ago, and I intend to keep paying attention." The woman from House Dunn, whose name I would later learn was Miriam, raised her hand with the practiced calm of someone calling a room to order. "Documentation," she said. "We'll need the medical confirmation and the bloodline records." "Standard protocol, I have them," Julio said, producing a folder from beneath his own set of papers, which meant he had brought them to this meeting in the expectation of this moment, which meant he had known I was going to do this today, which meant he knew me better after 3 months than most people had managed in years. I found that I was not surprised. I found that I was, in fact, entirely something else. The council voted at 3 in the afternoon. It was not a unanimous vote. House Varon abstained on procedural grounds that Lord Renard specified with considerable verbosity, but it was a majority, and under council charter, a majority was sufficient to recognize the restoration of a house whose heir had been confirmed. House Caldwell Wilson, vacant for 20 years, would be restored to the council. Its heir, currently standing by a sideboard in formal whites with a tea tray, would be given the standard 18-month integration period before assuming a full vote. After the vote, the delegates gathered their things with the particular mix of social recalibration that comes from an unexpected development in an otherwise routine meeting. There were formal acknowledgments directed at me, careful and correct, the kind of language that political people deploy when they need to update their behavior without admitting the previous behavior required updating. I received them with equal correctness and equal calm. When the room had emptied to the last few, Julio Shaw remained in his seat. He waited until even Sable had discreetly taken herself and her tablet into the corridor, then he looked at me. Well, he said. Well, I agreed. How are you? That, I said, is genuinely an enormous question for 3 o'clock on a Sunday. The smile arrived fully this time, unhurried and warm, and it was. I had decided some weeks ago in the privacy of my own small apartment, one of the more disarming things I had ever encountered. It made him look like himself, rather than like a representative of House Shaw, which was a distinction I had come to care about considerably more than was professionally advisable. I know, he said. I'll ask anyway. I thought about it honestly, the way I had been learning, over the course of 3 months, to do more of. Overwhelmed, I said. And not entirely displeased. Which is a combination I'm not very practiced with. You could sit down, he offered. For once, I looked at the council table. Long and oval and ringed with the chairs of the 7 most powerful alpha houses in the region. One chair, the 8th, had been symbolically left empty for 20 years. I pulled out the chair nearest to me, which happened to be adjacent to his, and I sat down. The chair was comfortable. The view from this side of the table was entirely different. There's something I want to say, Julio said, and his voice had changed register slightly, moved from the careful professional tone he used in most contexts into something quieter, more direct. All right, I said, this process, the search, the confirmation, the council vote, that was all separate. I want to be clear about that. I pursued it because my mother asked me to, and because it was the right thing, and because it had nothing to do with anything other than correcting an injustice. I know, I said, but there's also, he continued, with the measured care of a man who chooses his words deliberately and is choosing these with particular attention, the matter of the coffee shop. And the phone calls. And the fact that I have thought about you considerably more than the situation strictly required. I looked at him. I'm not saying this to complicate things, he said. You have more than enough to navigate. I'm saying it because I have found, in my experience, that not saying things clearly leads to worse outcomes than saying them awkwardly. That's a very reasonable approach, I said. I think you're remarkable, he said simply. I have thought so since you caught a water glass in a room full of alphas and didn't flinch. I intend to be wherever you'll allow me to be, at whatever pace you set, with no pressure and no expectation, because you have spent long enough having things happen to you rather than choosing them, and I would very much like for this to be something you choose. The room was quiet. The late afternoon light came through the windows at the long angle of an ending day, the kind of light that makes ordinary spaces beautiful and beautiful spaces ache. I thought about 12 houses. Brick walls. Wheezing coffee makers. Carrying trays and making myself invisible and the long, patient arithmetic of enough. I thought about gray eyes and letters sealed with wax and a coffee shop conversation that had lasted 2 hours and covered everything that mattered. I don't know how to do this, I said. Whatever this is, neither do I, particularly, he said. But I'm a reasonable person and you're an extraordinary one, and I think between us we can manage. I looked at the empty chair across the table, the one that had my name on it now, the one that had been waiting for 2 decades. The tea at these meetings is genuinely mediocre, I said. He looked surprised and then deeply, genuinely amused. I'll have it noted in the official record, as my first act as a council heir, I'd like to upgrade the tea service. Consider it done. I looked at him sideways. And the coffee, since Lord Renard is apparently suffering. Charlie, yes, you're deflecting. I exhaled slowly. Outside the window, the city was beginning to light itself for evening, the buildings becoming geometric constellations against a darkening sky. I know, I said. I'm working up to it. Take your time. So I did. I sat in the chair that had my name on it, in a room that had once made me invisible, beside a man who had been looking for me for reasons that were both entirely separate from and entirely wound up in the fact that he was, apparently, someone I was going to have to stop pretending I wasn't in the process of falling for. All right, I said finally. All right, I said again, and let the word carry what I meant by it, which was not a simple yes but something more like, I am choosing this. I am choosing to try. I am choosing to believe that not every change is something that happens to you, that some changes are doors and you can walk through them on your own terms with your hands steady and your eyes open. Julio Shaw looked at me with those dark gray eyes and his particular quality of unhurried attention, and he said nothing, because he did not need to, because some things are fully communicated without words, in the space between them, in the way a room feels when two people have stopped pretending something isn't true. I said. He laughed, quietly, genuinely, the kind of laugh that sounds like someone being ambushed by something pleasant. Yes, he said. Please. I got up and poured 2 cups from the carafe on the sideboard, the mediocre tea that was going to be upgraded as soon as I had the administrative standing to insist on it, and I brought both cups back to the table and set one in front of him and kept one for myself. And I sat down again, and we drank tea at the council table in the long afternoon light, and neither of us said anything for a while, and the silence was the easiest thing. The 18 months of integration passed the way large things pass, not quickly, not slowly, but with a density of event that made each week feel fuller than it should have been. I did not immediately abandon my job at the Aldenmere. This surprised some people, including Julio, though he did not say so directly, only asked once whether I was certain, and accepted my answer without argument. I was certain. I had things to learn, the business of a house, its assets and history and the political mechanics that governed its interactions with the other 6 families on the council. I was learning them from a standing start, reading case files and historical records late at night, sitting across from Sable twice a week for what she called briefings and what I called a graduate seminar in everything I should have been taught from birth. I was learning quickly, because I had always been quick at the things I bothered to learn, but I kept the morning shifts. I kept the early bus. I kept the sound of the kitchens at 5:30 and the quiet streets and the particular feeling of moving through a space that asked nothing of me except competence. Marjorie, when I told her the outline of what had happened, absorbed the information with exactly the equanimity I would have predicted from a woman who had worked at the Aldenmere for 20 years. Well, she said, at least you're punctual, always. I agreed. Don't let them make you into something you're not, she said. I won't. She patted my arm once, the most demonstrative thing I had seen her do in 2 years, and went back to her clipboard. Julio, and I did not rush. This was, I think, the thing that made it possible. He was a patient man in the genuine sense, not passive, not without opinion or desire, but possessed of a particular faith that things built carefully last longer than things built quickly, and he extended this philosophy to us with a consistency that I found, over time, both maddening and deeply reassuring. We had dinner, the kind without an agenda, without aides or folders, where the conversation went wherever it went and neither of us was representing anything except ourselves. We walked in the city on weekend mornings when neither of us had obligations, which was rarely but regularly enough to become a thing we did. We talked on the phone in the evenings with the ease of people who have discovered that the other person is genuinely interesting to talk to. Not because the topic is important but because the voice is. He had opinions about architecture and was embarrassed about how strong they were. He had read more poetry than he ever mentioned in professional contexts. He was, under the measured authority of his public manner, quietly funny, in a dry, understated way that I found more effective than the obvious kind. He took his coffee without sugar and his work without corners cut, and he was, toward everyone in his orbit, consistent and unperformable in his regard, which I had come to understand was a rarer quality than it should be. He thought my habit of rereading the same paperbacks was admirable. He disagreed with my opinions about Le Guin. Which meant we had 2 very good arguments about the nature of utopian fiction and I lost one of them and won the other and found I didn't particularly mind losing. I told him things I had not told other people. Not all at once, not as confession, but the way you tell a person things when you have been in close enough proximity long enough that the things find their own way out. About the 12 houses. About the specific texture of growing up without a thread that connects you to anything behind you. About the way I had learned to keep my hands steady as a form of self-preservation, because if your hands shook, people noticed you, and being noticed meant being assessed, and being assessed as an omega with no origins meant being found deficient in ways that exhausted me to think about. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interrupting, without trying to fix or reframe. You were never deficient, he said once, when I had finished a particular thread. I know that now, I said. I knew it abstractly most of the time. It's different to know it and feel it, yes, he said. It is. He knew things like that the gap between knowing and feeling is its own kind of distance. He knew it because he had his own version of the gap, different in content but structurally similar, the particular loneliness of authority, of being the person that rooms reorganize around, of rarely encountering someone who looks at you instead of at what you represent. We were, in our different ways, people who had been looked through. We were, with each other, people who were looked at, the night before my first full council vote, we were sitting in the kitchen of the apartment I had moved into 6 months prior, an actual apartment with more than one room and a window that faced something other than a brick wall, still modest by most standards and fine by mine. He was reading case notes. I was making tea. Nervous? He asked, without looking up. No, I said, which was partially true. You'll be fine, I know. I poured water and watched it change the color of the leaves in the pot. I'm just thinking about the first time I walked into that room. With the tray, a pause. I heard him set down the case notes. I noticed you immediately, he said. I want you to know that. Not because of any bloodline or house marker. You were just the most fully present person in the room. I turned to look at him. He was watching me with the expression I had, over months, accumulated a name for. Not just attention. Certainty. The kind that doesn't need to be performed because it is simply, quietly, true. You caught a glass, he said, in a room full of people waiting for someone to drop something. I crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him at the table. Julio, I said, Charlie, I'm going to ask you something. Yes, and I want you to answer it without being careful about it. He set the case notes entirely aside. All right, he said. I looked at him, this man who had appended my life and built it back up more carefully than it had ever been before and who looked at me like I was the most present person in any room. Stay, I said. It was not a complicated word. I had said more complicated things in the preceding months. But it contained, in its single syllable, everything I had been building toward, all the choosing and the opening and the deciding to believe that some things could be good and stay good. He reached across the table, his hand covered mine on the tabletop, warm and certain. I'm not going anywhere, he said. On a Tuesday morning in late autumn, I walked into conference room 7 of the Aldemir Grand Hotel for the first time without a tray. I wore a jacket that Sable had chosen and I had approved, dark green, the color of the East Wing carpets, which may or may not have been a deliberate choice on her part. My name tag was gone. There was a name card at the table, House Caldwell Wilson. The delegates filed in. They took their seats. The room settled. Julio Shaw came last, as he always did, precisely timed, the same unhurried quality, and he took his seat at the head of the table and looked around at the assembled council. His gaze found mine for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to be unprofessional, long enough to say everything. I placed my hand on the back of my chair, I pulled it out, I sat down, the 8th chair, vacant for 20 years, filled. Lord Renard of House Varon cleared his throat and said, with the particular resignation of a man making peace with developments he did not entirely welcome, I'd like to formally note that the quality of this hotel's tea continues to be substandard. It's been upgraded, I said. He looked at me. As of last month, I said, pleasantly. New supplier. You should find it considerably improved. A pause. He lifted his cup and took a careful sip. A longer pause. Acceptable, he said. Across the table, Julio Shaw was looking at his folder with the focused expression of a man who is absolutely not smiling. He was absolutely smiling. I opened my own folder and looked at the morning's agenda. Outside the windows of the East Wing, the autumn city was going about its business under a sky the color of shifting green and gray, and in conference room 7 of the Aldemir Grand Hotel, the Alpha Council met for its quarterly session with all 8 chairs occupied for the first time in 20 years. The tea was excellent, I knew, because I had chosen it.